Hey guys, tonight the first topic we explore reveals a haunting truth about the past. The way women's emotions, fears and mental health were once misunderstood, misdiagnosed and even punished. From ancient medicine to Victorian asylums, from so-called hysteria to dangerous remedies, your brain. You haven't even had coffee, but your pulse is already sprinting. Anxiety in the digital age isn't just internal, it's interactive and constant. You're expected to be available, responsive, successful, hydrated, emotionally balanced, and preferably glowing, all while maintaining a curated smile on a platform that calls itself social. The modern woman isn't just managing her life, she's managing her brand. And somehow anxiety is both a red flag and an aesthetic now. Posts with "my anxiety is bad today" can trend, as long as they're paired with the right filter and a caption that's self-aware but not too messy. Vulnerability sells, but only if it's digestible. And if you try to unplug, good luck. The world doesn't slow down. The algorithm punishes you. Emails pile up like guilt. Even meditation has become performance art, tracked by an app and graded by your smartwatch. Anxiety is everywhere, but so is advice. You can scroll through reels promising to cure your nervous system in under 30 seconds. Breathwork, matcha, journaling, tapping, all great tools until they become just another checkbox in your already overfilled day. And through it all, the root of women's anxiety remains surprisingly consistent. Pressure. The pressure to be liked, to be successful, to be informed, responsive, healthy, thin, ethical, kind, efficient, creative, funny, but not too funny. And don't forget to reply to your boss, your best friend, and that mum group chat that somehow never sleeps. It's no wonder your chest feels tight. Because in the age of being on 24/7, rest feels radical. Silence feels suspicious. And peace? That's a full-time job on its own. But here's the quiet truth. Your anxiety isn't a glitch. It's a signal that your nervous system wasn't designed for this much noise. After centuries of being silenced, sedated, shamed, and scrolled into exhaustion, something unexpected is happening. Women are slowing down. Not because the world has eased its grip. It hasn't. But because many are realizing that racing to meet impossible standards only leads to one place: burnout with a side of existential dread. So now, in corners of the internet and quiet living rooms, in yoga studios and therapy circles, a soft revolution is underway. It's not loud. It doesn't go viral. It doesn't wear matching athleisure or quote productivity gurus. It just rests. Rest as resistance. Rest as reclaiming. Rest as the long-forbidden medicine women were denied for centuries, not the forced kind prescribed by Victorian doctors, but the chosen kind. The kind that says, "I don't owe anyone my exhaustion." Women are learning to say no, not as a failure, but as a boundary. They're cancelling plans, logging off, letting the dishes sit in the sink. And shockingly, the world keeps spinning. It's not easy. The guilt is still there, whispering, "You should be doing more." But now there's another voice rising beside it, a quieter one. "You've done enough for today. Breathe." Communities are forming around this truth. Groups of women who hold space for each other without judgment. Who say, "Me too," instead of, "Why can't you just push through?" They're rewriting the narrative, one exhale at a time. They're learning that healing isn't linear, that some days you'll meditate and journal and go for a walk. Other days you'll cry into your cereal and delete your calendar. Both are okay. And maybe, just maybe, anxiety doesn't mean you're broken. Maybe it means you're awake, in a world that tries so hard to numb you. So tonight, if your mind is racing or your heart is heavy, remember this: you are not a machine. You were never meant to be. And in a culture that worships hustle and productivity, choosing to rest, truly rest, is not weakness. It's wisdom, ancient, sacred. revolutionary. Long before selfies, sailor sleeves, or regrettable lower back tributes, people were getting tattooed. In fact, the earliest known tattoos didn't belong to rebellious teenagers or battle-hardened warriors. They belonged to a man frozen in time, literally. Ötzi the Iceman, discovered high in the Alps in 1991, is over 5,000 years old. His body, preserved by snow, time and luck, is etched with 61 tattoos made of simple black lines and crosses. Not skulls, not dragons, just lines. But here's the thing. These lines weren't random. They were placed on joints, the spine, and the ankles. Modern researchers believe they may have been a form of early acupuncture or pain relief. An ancient blend of medicine and ritual, etched into the skin with soot and sharp tools. Primitive, yes, but also intentional. These weren't tattoos for show. They were tattoos for survival. And Ötzi wasn't alone. Across ancient Egypt, tattooed mummies, mostly women, have been found with intricate dot patterns across their bodies. Some archaeologists believe they were symbols of fertility, used to protect both mother and child during childbirth. Others think they were signs of devotion to the goddess Hathor. Either way, they weren't ornamental. They were spiritual, protective, worn proudly into the next life. In Siberia, tattooed Scythian nobles were buried in icy tombs, their bodies decorated with mythical animals, deer, panthers, griffins, curling across their arms and torsos in bold black ink. For these people, tattoos were a warrior's mark, a passport into the afterlife, and perhaps a sign of rank. These weren't the first humans to tattoo themselves. They were just the first we've found. And that's the quiet truth of tattoo history. It didn't begin with pop culture. It began with ritual, with pain, with intention. Tattoos were never just about beauty. They were medicine, memory, protection. Long before ink was rebellion, it was reverence. A sacred thread that wound its way through the skin. To tell stories when there were no books, to mark meaning before we had names for things. So the next time you see a simple line of ink, remember, someone did that, thousands of years ago, with fire and ash, and it meant everything. To understand the soul of tattooing, we have to drift across the ocean, to the islands of Polynesia, where ink was not fashion, but ceremony. In places like Samoa, Tonga, and Tahiti, tattoos were not chosen on a whim. They were sacred, earned, and carried for life. The very word tattoo comes from the Polynesian word tatau, meaning to strike, a reference to the sound made by the tapping of ink into skin with carved bone tools. This wasn't a machine. This was rhythm. Tatau was more than body art. It was a rite of passage, often painful, always meaningful. A young Samoan man would lie on a woven mat as the tattooist, or tufuga, worked for days, sometimes weeks, tapping intricate geometric patterns into his body with sharpened bone and soot. The design would stretch from the waist to the knees, a symbol of adulthood, identity, and bravery. The pain wasn't incidental. It was part of the ritual. To endure it was to prove you were ready. To back out mid-process brought shame, not just to you, but to your entire family. In Tahiti, tattoos told of genealogy and status. They might reflect divine protection, spiritual connection, or sexual maturity. A woman's fingers might be inked to signal readiness for marriage. A man's chest might tell of his warrior lineage. Every dot, every line, every curve, all sacred. Even today, in many Polynesian communities, tattoos retain this powerful role. They're not just expressions of self, they're connections to ancestry. Living records carried on skin, a living scroll. When Europeans first arrived in the Pacific during the 18th century, they were fascinated and horrified by what they saw. Sailors like Captain Cook recorded the practice in journals, and soon after, his crew began adopting tattoos themselves. Not to honour the ritual, but to mark their travels, a souvenir, a trend, stripped of meaning, but inked all the same. Still, the origin remained. Polynesian tattooing was never meant to be casual. It was sacred, personal, carried with pride through generations. Proof that your story was worthy of pain, and permanent enough to live just beneath the surface of the skin. As we shift eastward, the story of tattooing takes on a more complicated shape, one of beauty and punishment, honor and shame, all inked into flesh. In ancient China, tattoos carried a heavy stigma. Rather than symbols of spirituality or strength, they were often marks of disgrace. Criminals were tattooed on the face or neck with words like thief or traitor, permanent reminders to society of what that person had done and who they would never stop being. It was called qipei, branding for exile. Your punishment didn't end with your sentence. It stayed on your skin for life. And yet, even here, in the shadows of shame, tattooing held deeper layers. Some Chinese warriors voluntarily wore ink to show loyalty to their brothers or devotion to a cause. In the legendary novel Water Margin, one of the 108 heroic outlaws is said to have an entire body tattooed with imagery of dragons, tigers, and flames, a man's honor written on his skin like scripture. In Japan, the story is just as layered, maybe more. Early Japanese tattoos, called irizumi, were used to ward off evil spirits, protect fishermen, or even symbolize status. But as in China, tattoos also became tools of punishment. Criminals were marked with lines on the arms, or symbols on the forehead. In some regions, each crime added another stroke, a tally of dishonor visible to all. But over time, something changed. By the Edo period, 1600s, 1800s, full-body tattoos began to emerge as an underground art form. Vibrant, elaborate designs, dragons, koi fish, gods, demons, began to stretch across the backs, arms, and legs of commoners. These weren't criminals. These were firemen, laborers, and gamblers, men with dangerous jobs, and even more dangerous reputations. And then came the Yakuza, Japan's feared crime syndicates, who embraced full-body irizumi as symbols of strength, loyalty, and fearlessness. The more coverage, the more respect, and the more pain you endured. These weren't tattoos for the public. They were private, hidden beneath suits, revealed only in bathhouses or in battle. In both China and Japan, tattoos lived in tension, art and punishment, identity and exile. A constant dance between pride and shame. Because sometimes the ink that marks you also defines you. In ancient Europe, tattoos walked a thin line between power and punishment, depending entirely on who held the needle and who bore the mark. Let's begin with the Celts and the Picts, tribal peoples who lived in what is now Britain and Scotland. When Roman soldiers first encountered them, they were stunned. These warriors, some naked, some cloaked in wolf pelts, were covered in swirling blue tattoos, fierce spirals and knots etched across their faces and bodies. The dye? Woad, a plant-based ink that stained the skin deep blue, like thunderclouds rolled across flesh. These weren't decorations. They were battle armor, intimidation, identity. To tattoo your body was to declare, "I am not afraid to bleed." Julius Caesar described them in his writings, half in awe, half in horror, calling them wild and barbaric. Which is ironic, considering what Rome did next. Because while the Romans prided themselves on law and order, they also used tattoos, not as symbols of honor, but as tools of control. Criminals, slaves, and prisoners of war were tattooed with marks of ownership or shame. A runaway slave might be branded with the letters FVG, short for fugitivus. A soldier who deserted his legion, inked forever with disgrace. Even Roman Christians in the empire's early days were sometimes tattooed to mark them as enemies of the state, or worse, heretics. These were not badges. These were burdens. And yet, not all Roman tattooing was punishment. Some soldiers, particularly in the eastern provinces, began to tattoo themselves voluntarily, symbols of loyalty to their legion or devotion to a deity. Quiet rebellion inked beneath the armour. Over time, as Christianity spread and gained power, tattooing across Europe fell further into disrepute. By the early Middle Ages, it was largely condemned as pagan, sinful, or barbaric. The body was now seen as a temple, and temples, apparently, were best left unpainted. But deep in the forests and along the misty moors, the old traditions lived on, whispered through generations, passed from mother to daughter, warrior to warrior. Because long before ink was criminal, it was tribal. And in the blood-soaked soils of ancient Europe, tattooing was proof you belonged to your people, to your land, to your gods. As Europe entered the long stretch of the Middle Ages, tattooing faded from the spotlight, but it never vanished. It simply went underground. The Christian Church, now a dominant force across the continent, condemned tattooing. The body was to remain pure, unblemished, a vessel of holiness. Pagan customs, including tattoos, were swept aside, labelled heathen, rebellious, or worse, demonic. And yet, even in this era of suppression, ink still found its way beneath the skin. Among Christian pilgrims, especially those who made the treacherous journey to Jerusalem, tattoos became symbols of devotion. A small cross tattooed on the wrist or forearm was proof. I made it. You had survived the seas, the deserts, the bandits, and you came home marked by faith. Some pilgrims even received these tattoos while in the Holy Land, etched by Coptic Christian families who had preserved the sacred art for generations. These weren't decorative. They were spiritual contracts, reminders etched in flesh that said, I belong to God, and I went to his city. In some monasteries, tattoos were used to identify members of certain orders. Hidden symbols, discreet and purposeful. There are whispers, though rarely confirmed, of knights from the Crusades tattooing holy relics, saints, or sacred words onto their arms and chests before battle. If they were to die far from home, at least their body would bear the mark of heaven. Meanwhile, outside the church's walls, folk traditions endured. In remote villages and forested regions, old customs lingered. Women tattooed protective symbols on their hands during childbirth. Shepherds inked sacred patterns to ward off wolves. These weren't fashion statements. They were prayers with pigment. But still, to be tattooed in medieval Europe was to exist on the edges, spiritually suspect, socially scrutinized. Unless, of course, you were branded by force. Criminals, prisoners, slaves, all could be marked. And in those cases, the tattoo wasn't a choice. It was a sentence. So the Middle Ages became a paradox, a time when ink was both forbidden and revered, sacred and shamed. A time when tattoos weren't loud. They were whispers. Whispers of faith, of defiance, of the enduring human need to leave a mark, even when the world said not to. As the sails of European ships began cutting across oceans in the 16th and 17th centuries, tattoos returned to the Western world, not through science or religion, but through saltwater and superstition. Explorers like Captain James Cook didn't just map coastlines, they encountered cultures where tattooing was sacred, particularly in Polynesia. Cook's sailors, fascinated by the bold patterns and meanings of the tattoo, began getting inked themselves. It was exotic, dangerous and rebellious, all the things a bored sailor craved. From there, tattooing spread through the ports like spilled rum. Sailors began crafting their own tattoo culture, part survival, part tradition, and part bragging rights. A ship's anchor on the forearm meant you'd crossed the Atlantic. A turtle, you'd crossed the equator, officially a shellback. A pig and rooster on your feet, a charm to protect against drowning, because oddly enough, those animals were often the only ones to survive shipwrecks, floating safely in their wooden crates. Each tattoo had meaning, though the meanings often changed with the tides. An image of a dagger through a heart might mean lost love. or just a rough night in a Caribbean tavern. Hold fast across the knuckles was a prayer for grip, not on life, but on wet rigging in stormy seas. Tattooing became an unofficial language among sailors. No matter your flag, your mother tongue, or your luck with rum, ink could tell your story. It was shared identity in an ocean of loneliness. In dockside towns like New York, London, and Lisbon, tattoo parlours began to appear, small, smoky rooms filled with ink pots and tales from faraway lands. These weren't the artists of sacred temples. They were former sailors themselves, often using homemade needles and gunpowder soot. But for men who faced drowning, disease, and mutiny, a little pain for a permanent memory didn't seem so bad. Tattoos became keepsakes, confessions, maps of the places you'd been, and the parts of yourself you couldn't leave behind. In an era when most people's stories faded with time, sailors wrote theirs in ink, and let the sea carry them into legend. By the late 19th century, tattooing was no longer just the mark of the sailor or the outsider. Thanks to a spark, quite literally, from electricity, tattoos were stepping into the modern world. In 1891, Samuel O'Reilly, a New York-based tattooist, filed a patent for the first electric tattoo machine. Inspired by Thomas Edison's electric pen, O'Reilly's device allowed for faster, more precise work, and with far less blood. Suddenly, tattoos could be done in hours instead of days. Pain was still part of the package, but now the process felt less like surgery and more like art. And with this came a new era, the tattoo as performance. Circus sideshows and dime museums began to feature tattooed men and women as curiosities. There was Captain George Constantinus, the tattooed Greek prince, whose entire body was covered in intricate Eastern designs, and Nora Hildebrandt, one of America's first tattooed ladies, whose ink was matched only by the dramatic, and likely fabricated, tale of her captivity and forced tattooing by a savage tribe. These performers weren't just oddities, they were living exhibitions. Their bodies became walking stories, drawing crowds and challenging Victorian ideas of propriety, especially when a woman removed her sleeves and revealed a serpent curled around her shoulder. Yet, tattoos remained taboo among respectable society. If you had ink, it meant something. You'd been to war, to sea, to jail, or you'd run away with the circus. And yet, behind closed doors, the elite were quietly getting tattooed too. It's said that both King Edward VII and his son, the future George V, had tattoos, one with a Jerusalem cross, the other with a dragon etched in Japan. Aristocrats in Europe and even some American high society figures began to explore the novelty of body art. Discreetly, privately, always with plausible deniability. Tattoo parlours flourished in port cities, but now they began appearing in urban centres too, small studios tucked between barbershops and billiard halls. And while most artists were still men, women were beginning to enter the craft, needle in hand. The ink was spreading. No longer just a mark of rebellion, it was becoming a medium for memory, identity, or simply the thrill of wearing something no one could take away. As the 20th century marched forward with skyscrapers, revolutions and wars, tattoos continued their quiet evolution, but not always in the light. Behind prison walls, in locked cells and concrete yards, a new language of ink was being written, not on paper, but on skin. These weren't polished studio tattoos, they were handmade, raw, created with contraband needles, guitar strings, melted plastic, and ink brewed from soot and toothpaste. Painful? Absolutely. Precise? Rarely. Meaningful? Always. In prisons across the world, from Russia's gulags to American penitentiaries, tattoos became a secret code. Every image told a story. Every placement carried weight. A spiderweb on the elbow, time served, a teardrop near the eye, a life taken, or a life lost. 5 dots on the hand, 4 corners and 1 in the centre, meant I am surrounded. In Soviet prisons, tattooing became a detailed system of status and survival. A cathedral inked across the chest could signal years behind bars. Each dome, a sentence, stars on the shoulders, a high-ranking inmate, not to be disrespected, but faking a rank through ink, that could get you killed. These tattoos weren't just decoration, they were armor, a resume, a warning, a prayer. In the United States, prison tattoos carried similar weight. Gang affiliations, racial lines, territorial claims, and personal losses. The tattoo gun was often a shared tool, the ink passed between inmates like contraband communion. For many, their first tattoo wasn't a choice. It was a rite of passage. But even outside the walls, these prison-born styles began to leak into the wider world. Artists, especially in urban areas, began incorporating the stark, bold lines of prison art into their own work. What started as survival behind bars became a style, replicated in shops, immortalized in movies, and echoed in street culture. Still, the stigma clung. A visible tattoo, especially one on the hands, neck, or face, often meant closed doors, judgment, suspicion. The ink might fade, but the assumptions remained. Yet for the ones who wore them, those marks weren't shame. They were stories of survival, of time endured, of identity carved in silence. Because sometimes, when no one listens, the skin speaks. By the dawn of the 21st century, tattoos had undergone their greatest transformation yet. From ancient rite to outlaw code to something else entirely, a canvas for the self. What was once hidden under sleeves or spoken in hushed judgment was now proudly displayed on runways, in boardrooms, and across social feeds. From baristas to CEOs, kindergarten teachers to veterans, ink was no longer a symbol of rebellion. It had become a declaration of identity. The rise of tattoo studios mirrored this shift. No longer backroom shops with flickering neon signs, many became sanctuaries of expression, clean, curated, and often more like art galleries than the gritty dens of old. Tattoo artists became celebrities in their own right, with portfolios, waitlists, and fans who flew across countries just to sit in their chair. Styles exploded. Watercolor tattoos, fine-line minimalism, realism so sharp it looked like photographs, sacred geometry, cultural revival, portraits of pets, loved ones, even entire life stories inked spine to spine. Technology helped. Machines became quieter, needles finer, ink safer, healing faster. But beneath the aesthetics, the old reasons remained. People still came for the same things they always had: memory, mourning, power, rebirth. Some tattoos marked milestones, a birth, a death, a beginning. Others covered scars, both visible and hidden. Some people tattooed themselves after escaping abusive relationships. Some honoured ancestors. Some wrote their survival in symbols they couldn't speak aloud. And yes, some just really liked frogs with cowboy hats. There's room for that too. Across the globe, indigenous tattoo practices began to resurface with pride. Maori tamoko, Inuit skin stitching, Filipino batok. Ancient forms once shamed or outlawed were being revived by new generations, reconnecting lineage through line work. Yet, debates remain. About cultural appropriation, about over-commercialization, about whether something sacred can survive when it becomes a trend. But maybe that's the beauty of it. Tattoos have always existed in tension, between pain and pride, permanence and impermanence, who we are and who we want to be. And so, we return to where we began. Ink, pressed into skin. A story told without words, a mark made, not for approval, but for truth. And in the quiet, ancient language of tattooing, that's always been enough. The story of the space race didn't begin with a spaceship or a starry-eyed dream. It began with war. World War II had left the planet in ruins, cities shattered, borders redrawn, and two superpowers standing on opposite sides of a new world order. The United States and the Soviet Union, once uneasy allies, emerged as ideological opposites: capitalism versus communism, democracy versus dictatorship. And in the ashes of Nazi Germany, both sides found something, or rather, someone, they wanted. Werner von Braun, the German engineer behind the deadly V-2 rocket, was captured by the Americans and quietly whisked to